This sounds insane, but it actually happened. A man being surrounded by Bigfoot. Not once, but night after night. It happened. Deep in the forests of Oregon, a 70-year-old man lived completely alone, until strange gifts began to appear on his porch. Intricate rock formations, rare feathers, and the skulls of deer, arranged with purpose. What's even stranger? When he responded with simple offerings, like a bowl of apples, the gifts came back even more elaborate. Star maps made of stone, carvings of unknown symbols. He wasn't dealing with a creature. He was communicating with an entire tribe, intelligent, organized, with language, art, and rules. This isn't fiction. It's drawn directly from the journals of Elden Braith, a retired railroad engineer who vanished into the woods after losing everything. And in this video, you'll discover how these creatures communicate through symbols, what one bowl of coins did to spark their fury, and how Elden went from being watched to being accepted. When their wounded leader collapsed at his doorstep, Elden could have run. Instead, he chose compassion. He bandaged the creature's wounds, and in return, he earned the one thing no human had ever received: trust. If you skip this story, you'll miss the one moment that turned fear into connection and revealed a hidden world that might still be watching us from the trees. The wind tore through the pine ridges that night like a long-held breath being let go. Cold, bitter, sharp enough to wake ghosts. Elden Braith stood under the creaking frame of his porch roof, a battered lantern trembling in his hand, casting its amber light across the mud-slick earth below. That's when he saw it again. Deep in the muck, half covered by broken needles and half frozen in place. A footprint. Not human. Too long, too wide. 18 inches from heel to toe. 5 distinct toes, like a man's, but thicker. He didn't crouch to touch it this time. He already knew it was real. The night before, something had brushed past his cabin. Not just brushed, collided. Something large, heavy, alive. The thud against the west wall had rattled the frame and sent the chimney ash trembling down the stovepipe. Elden had grabbed the 30-30 out of instinct, but when he stepped out onto the porch, barefoot in his long johns, his breath curling into the black, there was nothing. Just trees whispering secrets, just shadows breathing. But this morning, he found it. Not just the track, the horn. Broken, sharpened at the base, and slick with something still dark and tacky. It had been lodged in the bark of the cedar by the corral, as if thrown, as if lost in some violent, midnight struggle that left no other trace. Elden now sat on the edge of the porch rail, slowly picking the horn splinter from his palm. The cut was shallow but bled more than it should. His skin had thinned with age, just like his grip on certainty. The mountains didn't care about certainty. North Umpqua was a place for forgetting. 60 acres of rotting pine, steep slopes, moss-dark gullies, and silence so deep it throbbed. There was no electricity, no phone lines, no TV, no gas. Just a hand-pumped well, a root cellar, a sagging barn, and the one-room cabin his father built with hand tools before Elden was born. When his wife died, then his daughter. When the world became too loud with pain and too empty to answer, this was where he came. Not to live, not to die, just to be. The land asked nothing of him but to stay quiet. For 2 years, nothing had broken that quiet. Until now. 3 nights ago, he started hearing it. A sound so unnatural in its rhythm that it turned the marrow inside his bones. 3 knocks, always 3, always from a different direction in the trees. Never closer than the edge of the clearing, but always felt like being watched through fogged glass. Knock, knock, knock. Not the crack of falling branches, not a woodpecker, not anything made by storm or squirrel. No, this was intentional, and last night it had touched his house. Elden didn't tell anyone. Who would he tell? His sister, Loretta, lived 5 miles downriver, and she'd already stopped answering his letters. Said he needed to come back to town. Said grief was eating him alive. Said people weren't meant to live alone in the woods. Elden didn't argue. He just stopped writing. He moved stiffly now, favoring the left leg that never healed quite right after the rail accident in '82. It was the only thing he'd brought back from the company, aside from the pension checks and the guilt. He glanced out over the field. The morning light was dim, gray, filtered through clouds that hung too low. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cackled once and then fell silent. The pasture was empty except for the cows, chewing slowly near the broken fence. And near the post, another shape. Elden squinted. It was no animal. It was his workbench mallet, one he hadn't seen in a week. Placed upright in the dirt with surgical precision, head up, handle buried. Clean. Unnaturally clean. And next to it, a spiral of rocks. Tiny river stones, not found anywhere near this part of the mountain. He didn't move. Something was trying to talk. Later, as twilight bled into the ridgelines, Elden took out the old apple barrel he used during cider season and filled it with 5 of his best red Gravensteins. He wasn't sure why he was doing it. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was a man too old and too tired to care if he looked crazy to no one. He placed the barrel under the porch light. Didn't say a word, just turned the lantern off and shut the door. That night the knocking returned, but this time, not just from one side. It came in layers, first east, then north, then west. 3 knocks each, spaced apart like a slow, deliberate ritual. And then silence so thick Elden could hear his own pulse in his ears. He sat by the window, staring into blackness, the rifle across his knees. But nothing came out of the trees. He didn't sleep. At dawn, when the frost still clung to the ferns, Elden stepped outside barefoot again. The apples were gone. Not eaten. Gone. Barrel untouched. No cores, no peels. Just a feather, black, with a white tip, laid neatly where the fruit had been. He crouched this time. Beside the feather were footprints. 2 sets. One, large, massive, even, 18 inches again, deep set with clear toe spread. The other, smaller, not child-sized, but not the same. A different weight, a different gait. And it wasn't just that. There were smudges in the mud where knees had pressed down. Something had crouched, sat, waited. Elden backed away slowly, his breath caught in his throat. That night, he tried not to listen. He lit a fire in the stove, poured himself a measure of the blackberry brandy Loretta made last summer, and kept the radio silent. He told himself it was over, that maybe it had just passed through. Maybe it was migrating. Maybe the mountain still belonged to him, but deep down, he knew better. It was near midnight when he heard it again. Not knocking this time. Not even a sound. It was presence. That primal certainty, older than language, that something is watching you. And when he finally dared to look out the front window, he saw them. 3 silhouettes standing just past the tree line. Still, huge. Shoulders like stone, heads slightly tilted as if listening. But what made Elden's knees buckle wasn't them. It was what stood farther back. A 4th figure. Smaller, slender, not a child, not human, just watching. It didn't move. Didn't step forward. Didn't run. It just stood there, the fog curling around its limbs like breath held in the cold. Eyes glowing amber when the firelight caught them. Curious, calm, Elden turned away. He didn't know why. Shame, maybe. Fear. Or the weight of something ancient now pressing against his heart. And for the first time since the day they buried his daughter, Elden whispered aloud, "I see you." Then silence again, but not the safe kind. The kind that meant something had been awakened. And whatever it wasn't done. Not yet. The rain came soft that morning, not in sheets, but in a whisper. just enough to make the porch boards hiss beneath Elden's boots as he stepped outside. A low mist clung to the soil like something half asleep, unwilling to lift. The sky above North Umpqua was the color of old pewter, heavy and unmoving. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Elden stood still, eyes sweeping the clearing in front of his cabin, half expecting the spiral of stones to have vanished, the feather to have blown away. But they were still there, undisturbed, like offerings at the edge of some ancient church, left in silence and meant to be received, not questioned. He walked down the steps, careful not to slip on the slick grain of the wood. His hands were cracked from cold and time, but steady as ever. The mallet was still upright in the soil, not even leaning. That part gnawed at him. Wind should have knocked it over. Even a deer brushing past would have sent it tumbling. But it stood like it had roots. Beside it now, something new. The axe, the one he'd lost 3 weeks ago after cutting down the storm-damaged pine by the South Ravine. It had disappeared clean. He searched half the slope that day, cursed under his breath, blamed his age, and let it go. And here it was, placed gently in the same spot where the apples had been, its blade polished to a sheen he hadn't seen in years, its handle freshly sanded, smooth, and carved into the wood near the base. An unfamiliar symbol, not random, not decorative. It looked like a spiral, but imperfect, one line overlapping another. It reminded him of something ancient, petroglyphs he'd seen once on a rail trip through New Mexico. He ran his finger across it slowly. The groove wasn't shallow. Whoever did this took their time. He didn't say a word. Back inside, he pulled out one of his father's old notebooks, the kind with yellowed graph paper and a cracked leather spine, and began to sketch. He drew the spiral as best as he could recall, then the footprint, the stones, the feather. He didn't know what to call this part of himself that had awakened, but it felt like the engineer in him, the man who once mapped train lines across shifting ridges, had returned, not to measure steel, but something older. And then there were the gifts. Later that day, he found another arrangement, on the far side of the barn. This time, 3 crow feathers bound together at the quill with a thin strand of animal sinew, laid across the center of a deer skull. Not fresh, not bleached. Old, weather-worn, but clean. Deliberately so. It wasn't grotesque. It wasn't a warning. It felt like a message. Elden stood over it for a long time. His mind pulled toward his daughter again. Her face, her hands, the sound of her bare feet racing across the floor when she was 5. He remembered how she used to bring him things from the woods, rocks shaped like hearts, pine cones that looked like tiny birds, bones she called lucky. He always pretended to be amazed, always kept them in the windowsill above the kitchen sink, even long after she stopped bringing them. He never told her how much he loved them. That evening, when the clouds broke just enough to let a bit of amber light slip through, Elden placed something outside again. Not apples this time. Not food. A bowl, hand-carved. Old. The one he'd made the summer his wife got sick, back when his hands still remembered how to shape wood with gentleness. He placed it in the center of the porch, and inside, 5 red apples, again. But he wrapped each one in cloth. Not to preserve them. As a gesture, as a sign of care. He stepped back into the cabin without watching the tree line. No lantern tonight. He sat by the wood stove with the fire low and closed his eyes, listening. The wind didn't knock this time. It sang, a slow rise and fall, like a breath moving through trees. And somewhere between the fire's crackle and the night's hush, Elden heard it. Not words, not music, just rhythm. 3 long tones, low, felt more than heard, like a drum pressed deep beneath the earth. Faint but unmistakable. He stayed up, and just before dawn, unable to resist, He took the old kerosene lamp and stepped into the fog. The bowl was gone. In its place, a bone, polished, pale, notched with marks along one side, evenly spaced like a counting stick. But it wasn't just that. On the side of the cabin wall, propped carefully in the space between the window and the eave, was a small length of driftwood. And carved into it, his house. Clearly, precisely. Roof, porch, the outline of the barn, even the crooked pine by the fence. It was him, his home, mapped and given back. He brought it inside with both hands. All that day he didn't work, didn't mend the fence, didn't check the traps. He sat at the table, driftwood in front of him, the spiral still fresh in his mind. Something had drawn this, not scratched, not hacked, but drawn, observed. They had been watching him for a while. That night, he walked beyond the porch for the first time in weeks, past the edge of the clearing, into the brush, into the deep ferns that curled like sleeping fists. He followed the sound of the creek. His breath came visible in puffs, the lantern a dim pulse in the dark. And then he stopped. Across the creek bed, just past the veil of mist, 3 figures, still towering. Elden didn't move. They stood not more than 20 yards away, tall as the saplings behind them. Shoulders hunched forward, arms long, unmoving. Their faces, if they had any, were hidden by the dark. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They waited. Elden slowly lowered the lamp, and that's when he saw it. Off to the side, half shadowed by the slope, another figure. Smaller. Not much, but enough. Slight in build. Not adult, not child. Somewhere between, not standing still like the others. This one moved, not toward him, just side to side, watching, then still, eyes glowing faint, catching the light just once. Elden turned, heart hammering, mouth dry, not with fear, but something worse. Recognition. He knew now. This wasn't about curiosity. This was about choice. Contact had already happened. This was something more. As he stepped back toward the cabin, the forest didn't chase. It just exhaled. The sound of his own footsteps crunching damp leaves seemed louder than it should. He didn't look back. But long after he latched the door behind him, long after the lamp was extinguished and the fire died down to a soft red glow, Elden sat awake, and in the silence, he whispered one word into the dark. "Why?" No answer came, only the drip of melted frost against the windowsill, and a feeling, slow and cold, creeping into his bones, that he had just crossed a line he couldn't walk back over. The wind had stilled for 3 days. No knocking, no drumming. Just that kind of eerie calm that didn't feel like peace. It felt like the mountain had turned its face away to see what he'd do next. Elden hadn't stepped past the edge of the pasture since that night by the creek, but he kept watching. Not out of fear. He was long past that. It was something else now, like waiting for a language he'd never learned to suddenly make sense. On the 4th morning, the gift was different. Not stones, not feathers, not meat or bones. A bone, yes, but carved. He found it lying in the hollow of the porch beam, nestled like a message tucked into the knuckles of the house. It was pale, maybe from a deer, maybe older. And etched into its surface, scratched so fine he nearly missed it, was a drawing. Not a shape this time. A map. It took him a full hour to understand what he was looking at. But once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The house, the barn, the fence, his vegetable patch, the ridge to the west, and something more, an arc of high land past the ravine, cut with lines like trails, places he'd never walked. But whoever drew this had been there, had watched, had measured. It wasn't just a map of his land. It was a map of their world intersecting his. He took out the old field journal again, the one with the cracked spine, and began recording measurements, elevations, angles of sight. It felt automatic, like muscle memory from decades back when he rode in rail cars across open country, measuring curve angles and bridge stress tolerances. But this wasn't steel and timber anymore. This was wilderness, and whoever they were, they had been studying him. That evening, after sundown but before full dark, he lit no fire, just let the cabin slip into shadow, as if trying to see what they saw. A part of him wondered if they only came when things were quiet, when his world stopped trying to make noise. He sat near the window for hours, and then it happened. Movement, not near the clearing, but to the left of the barn, near the stump line. He watched, breath still. Two shapes, low to the ground. Not crawling, dragging, not in panic, in discipline. One larger, one smaller. The larger one held the other by the back of the neck, not harshly, but firmly. The smaller resisted just a little. A stumble, a turn of the head. Elden could feel it. Not fear, shame. The larger one paused, raised a hand, waited, and then gone. Slipped into the darkness like breath into mist. Elden didn't sleep that night. When he walked out the next morning, he didn't look for apples or offerings. He walked straight to where they had stood. The earth was damp from fog. The prints were perfect. The larger footprints overlapped with smaller ones, almost protectively. The stride was even, purposeful. But the small ones, they hesitated. One foot planted sideways, one toe curled just enough to drag through the soil. He crouched there, fingers just grazing the dirt, and felt a sudden ache, like watching a child being pulled away from something they didn't want to leave. He'd seen that once, long ago, at a hospital in Medford. His daughter, she was maybe 6 then, crying at the door because he couldn't stay. He told her he had to go back to work. She had held onto his hand like it was the last thing on earth that made sense. And he let go. That memory hit him like a hammer, sharp and uninvited. He stood, jaw clenched. Something was happening, and it had nothing to do with curiosity anymore. That night, he left something different on the porch. Not food, not a bowl, but his measuring tape. The old steel one with rust around the edges, the one he'd used since 1968. He unrolled it to 20 feet. Then he laid it out straight across the porch floor, pinned with 4 stones. Not as an offering, as a message. I understand what you're doing. The forest didn't answer that night, but 2 days later it did. He heard it just past midnight. Not knocking, not movement, a whisper, not a voice, a vibration. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Cold bit into his skin. He saw nothing at first, but at the far end of the porch, where the measuring tape had been, something new. Not a replacement, a response, a piece of wood. Straight, smooth, about 2 feet long, and along its side, etched lines, spaced exactly. Each notch mirrored the marks on his own tape. They had measured back. He stood there, staring at it under the glow of his lantern. His breath fogged the glass, and for a split second he felt something behind the trees. A presence. Not close, not hostile, but there, watching, acknowledging. He didn't wave, didn't speak. He simply bowed his head, and for the first time, the woods felt warmer. But it didn't last. The next morning, down by the pasture fence, he found something that made his stomach turn. A single bone, small, fresh, cracked in the middle like it had been snapped by hand. And beside it, a tiny tuft of fur. Dark, fine, unmistakably similar to the smaller shape he'd seen days ago. This wasn't a gift. This was a warning. But not from the ones he'd met. From something else. He brought the bone inside, wrapped it in cloth, placed it in the drawer where he kept the carved maps. He didn't know what it meant yet, but the message was clear. Not all of them agreed. That night he locked the doors, and for the first time in years, he took the rifle from its wall rack and laid it by the window. Not to use, just to feel its weight again. But deep down he knew, the real danger wasn't coming from outside. It was already watching from within. Elden had only been gone 2 nights. A visit he hadn't wanted to make, but guilt had a way of pulling at his ribs harder than any storm wind ever could. Loretta had called him foolish again, told him he looked thinner, asked what he was eating, tried not to look scared when she caught sight of the old wound on his left hand. He didn't tell her anything, not about the figures, not about the maps, not about the measured silence that had begun to take shape around his cabin like a second skin. She wouldn't have believed him, and even if she did, it wouldn't help. Some things grow best in silence, and whatever had rooted itself in that forest, it didn't want outside eyes. When he drove back up the old trail and crested the final ridge, something felt wrong before he even saw it. The cows were missing, all of them. The gate to the corral had been pushed open, not broken, not trampled, just opened. Deliberate, as if someone had made a decision. Elden stepped out of the truck, left the door hanging open, and stood still in the gravel. The only sound was wind moving low through the pines. No flies, no bird song, not even a distant low from the herd. Just the distant rattle of dry needles and the deep humming pressure of wrong. Then he saw them, 4 trees, torn from their roots, not by saw, not by rot, ripped from the ground and jammed into the earth at odd angles. They weren't placed randomly. They formed a boundary, a giant X, right through the middle of his land, crossing just where the clearing touched the edge of the woods. Fresh dirt, black and wet, clung to the roots like blood on fingers. He walked slowly, boots crunching over broken pine cones. One of the trees had gouges in its bark, long, curved. Claw marks, maybe. Maybe not. By the front steps, he stopped cold. There, set into the earth like a tombstone, was a slab of black stone he'd never seen before, almost obsidian. It shimmered faintly under the overcast sky, and on its surface, a carving. Him, not a face, not exact, but unmistakable. His posture, his coat, the curved outline of his hat. Standing in the center of 12 shapes, looming figures with long limbs and blank faces, encircling him, close, too close. He stared for a long time, jaw locked. A chill ran up the center of his back, not from the air, but from a thought he didn't want to finish. The drawing wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a mirror. He was being studied, or claimed. He went inside without lighting the stove, sat in the dark. The silence felt too wide, like something waited on the other side of it, just out of reach. He thought about packing up, thought about driving into town. But the moment the idea formed, he felt it tighten around him like a noose of vines. He couldn't, not now. That cabin was the last thing he had left in the world that hadn't been touched by other people's hands. He wasn't going to leave it to vanish into memory. Instead, he did something he hadn't done since the night his daughter died. He lit a candle, not for light, for offering. Then he took a small tin box from the cupboard, blew the dust off the lid, and opened it slowly. Inside, folded and worn thin, were old bills. 20s and 10s, a few silver dollars, tucked away from years ago when he used to think there'd be an emergency worth preparing for. He took 5 bills and 3 coins, wrapped them in flannel, and placed them inside a wooden bowl. Then he carried it outside, hands steady. He set it right on the black stone. Then he whispered, almost too soft to hear, "This is what I have." He didn't expect a response. But that night, as the wind rose, a sound floated through the trees. Not footsteps, not drums, not the deep knocking he had grown used to. This was a voice. Low, female, not human, not beast. It moved along the wall of the cabin, slow and rising like a chant without words. Like a memory that hadn't yet chosen its shape, Elden froze by the window, staring into nothing. The sound wasn't frightening. It was beautiful. It broke something open in him he didn't even know was still locked. The sound of mourning. The sound of an old song from a throat too wild for language. And just as quick as it came, it faded. By dawn, the air was still. The candle had burned itself out in a pool of wax. And when he stepped outside, he saw them. 12 footprints. arranged in a near-perfect circle around his cabin. Deep, precise, undisturbed. They hadn't just visited. They had surrounded him. They had watched through the night, and he hadn't heard them move. He crouched low beside one of the prints, the same shape as before. 18 inches, splayed toes. But now he noticed something new. A faint line dragging across the center, as if something had been carried or pulled. He traced the edge of the heel with his fingers and found himself whispering without meaning to. "What do you want from me?" But the forest gave no answer, not that day. Instead, it gave him silence, a silence thick enough to weigh on the air, pressing into his chest like a secret that had stopped waiting to be kept. Something had changed. The balance, the rhythm, the way the woods breathed around his home. Elden knew it in his bones. They were no longer trying to see if they could reach him. They had decided they already had. It came on the wind, brittle and strange, the scent of pitch sap and old smoke. Not from the hearth, from deeper, from the woods. Elden had smelled it before, long ago, at the site of a train wreck in northern Montana. Cold metal and scorched pine, the smell of something old being broken open. That morning the frost hadn't yet melted when he saw it. A piece of bark, curved and dark, laid on the ground beneath the largest pine at the edge of the clearing. It hadn't fallen. It had been placed. He could tell by the smooth imprint in the loam. The edges were curled inward as if heat had once kissed it. But it wasn't the texture that caught his breath. It was the image burned into its surface. Him, 2 arms raised, not in surrender, but in offering. A posture of welcome or sacrifice. It was hard to tell which. And around his feet, a ring of shapes. Spirals again, thicker now, more layered, almost like roots, curling toward his ankles, binding him, inviting him. He stood there a long while, staring at it with the kind of stillness that makes time itself hesitate. Then he moved. Back inside, he gathered only 2 things: the old leather satchel his father once used for field work, and the knife. Not the hunting blade by the door, not the rusted pocket knife in the drawer, but the old one, the one carved from bone and obsidian, with a carved hilt and no sheath. His father had given it to him when he was a boy, and said only this: "You don't carry this unless you're ready to leave something behind." He hadn't touched it in years. He wrapped it in cloth, placed it in the bag, and added one more thing: a bundle of dried sage and sweetgrass he'd kept since the funeral. He didn't know what good it would do, but it felt right. Not protection, not defense, something older. He crossed the field just after noon, following the edge of the ridge, past where the cows had once grazed, past the place where the X of trees still stood like crucifixes half buried in the mud. And then deeper, down into the ravine where the light broke in sharp shards between the trees. The air changed there. It always did. Colder, not from wind, but from absence. He kept going. It was almost 2 miles in when he found it. A mouth of stone, half covered in moss and lichen, shaped not by accident, but erosion, time, and hands that knew how to hide things. The opening was no wider than a doorway, tall enough for him to enter hunched. On either side, small carvings barely visible in the fading light, spirals again, crossed lines, symbols too old for names. He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. The air inside was still, not dead, alive in a way that made his ears ring. The space wasn't large, just enough to hold maybe 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder, but the walls were covered, etched and scorched and carved with the same strange language that had followed him since the first apple offering. And at the center, beneath a jagged overhang of stone, an altar. Not in the church sense. No bones, no blood. Just a flat slab, low to the ground, smoothed over centuries. He knelt, unsure why. From the bag, he took the sage and lit the edge with a match. Smoke rose slowly, curling around the ceiling like breath returning to the mouth of the earth. He placed the blade beside it, then bowed his head, He didn't speak. But something answered. A sound, not voice, not echo, but movement. Just outside. He stood quickly, hand instinctively going to the knife, then paused. Nothing entered. But when he stepped out again into the open, the forest had changed. The path behind him, gone. Not covered, gone. Like the trees had moved while he was inside. He turned slowly. At the edge of the clearing, where the light barely touched the roots, were shapes. Not standing, watching, not close, but there. And when he returned to the cabin, hours later, maybe more, everything he had ever placed outside, every bowl, every cloth-wrapped apple, every small token, had been shattered, crushed, laid out in a perfect spiral across the clearing. A spiral so large it reached to the fence post and curled back toward the porch steps. Its center pointed not at the house, but at the woods. The message was clear. He had crossed a line they had drawn. He had stepped outside the circle and broken the order. That night the knocking returned. Not 3 taps, not soft, but drumming, fast, loud, surrounding the house like a heartbeat about to burst. Every wall, every window, the roof, the earth beneath the floorboards. He didn't light a lamp. He sat in the dark. And for the first time, he understood. This was not anger. This was instruction. A call to return, a demand to decide, not just observe, belong, or disappear. And as the sound rose to a pitch so fierce it felt like his bones would crack, the air went still. The silence didn't fall. It pressed. And he sat there, alone, in the hollow breathing of the mountain, waiting to understand what would come next. The storm didn't come with thunder. It crept. Low fog crawled up from the river bottom like it had somewhere to be, swallowing the lower trees in silence. The air was wet, not from rain, but from the kind of cold that seeps through flannel and into the bones. Elden hadn't slept. He'd barely moved. The house had stopped feeling like a house. It was something else now, part shelter, part altar, part cage. The drumming had stopped before dawn. Not faded, stopped, like a switch had been thrown, like the mountain had blinked. He stood at the window, hands on the cold sill, staring out at the yard. Nothing moved, not even the wind. It was the kind of stillness that made you think something was about to arrive, or maybe already had. Then he saw it. At first he thought it was just a fallen tree, a strange shadow against the edge of the clearing. But the shape wasn't right. Too tall, too wide through the chest. And then it shifted, just slightly, and his gut twisted. He moved for the door. Not fast, slow, like each step had to ask permission. Outside, the silence broke. Breathing. Heavy, labored, the kind that came from a chest too large for this world. It was slumped near the old water trough, half in the mud, half on its side. One massive hand gripped the rim. The other dangled loose. Its fur was thick, dark, and soaked. But not with rain. Blood. Not red. Almost black. So much of it that the soil beneath had turned into a thick, dark paste. It wasn't dead. Not yet. Elden stopped 3 feet away. The shape lifted its head slowly, eyes meeting his. And in that single glance, everything else fell away. There was no fear in its face, no panic. Just a look that said, "You're the only one left." He didn't speak, didn't run. He crouched. The creature, taller than any man Elden had ever known, broader than the old freezer in the barn, made a sound like gravel shifting underwater. It tried to rise. Failed. Blood poured faster. Elden reached out before he even realized it. His hand touched its shoulder, warm, damp, pulsing. It didn't pull back. Its breathing slowed. He stood again, turned without a word, and went inside. The stove was still warm. He lit a fire, boiled water, gathered every cloth he could find, towels, shirts, an old table runner. The old medicinal kit from his father's time still sat above the pantry, untouched for years. Dried moss, crushed willow bark, alcohol, thread. He filled a basin, grabbed the lantern, and went back out. He worked for hours, didn't question how or why, didn't flinch when he saw the gash in its side, long, deep, torn through fur and hide like someone had tried to split it open from hip to ribs. The wound was clean-edged, sharp, not clawed, not an accident, a punishment. The creature never made a sound, not once. Its breath hitched when he poured alcohol on the wound, but it didn't growl. It didn't strike, just held still. And when he pressed the cloth to stop the bleeding, its hand, massive, rough, twice the size of his own, reached out, not to push him away, but to touch. Fingers grazed Elden's chest, brief, gentle, then fell again. He didn't speak. He sewed. Thread pulled tight. Skin closed over ragged edges. His hands trembled only once, when the lantern flickered and cast a shadow across the creature's face. It wasn't just an animal. It never had been. There were lines around its eyes, like age, like memory. Elden had seen that face once before. Not in full, but enough. That night at the tree line. The leader. The one that didn't move. The one that watched. And now it lay bleeding in his yard. He carried the creature inside before nightfall. Not easy. Dead weight. But it helped. Just enough to show it understood. It leaned against him. Let him guide. Let him pull. He cleared the space by the hearth. Laid it on the rug. Brought the wool blanket from the cot and draped it over its midsection. Set a pot of water to steam. Added crushed mint leaves. The scent filled the cabin, sharp and sweet. The fire crackled low. Outside, the fog thickened. But no one came. No watchers, no knocks, no drumming. He was being left alone, or tested. The night passed in pieces. The creature drifted in and out of consciousness, eyes fluttering beneath the heavy brow. Once, it stirred, fingers twitching. Elden took its hand, held it, not tightly, just enough. And then it moved. Not its body, its hand. It reached toward him, palm open. Something rested inside. Small, hard, round. A stone. He didn't understand at first. Then he saw it. The shine, the etching, the spiral. But not just any. This one glowed faintly. Not light, not heat. Just a feeling. He took it. Closed his hand around it. And in that moment, the sound returned. Not outside, inside. A rhythm, a memory, not his. A train yard, smoke, screams, fire, a daughter crying, a man standing at the edge of a hospital bed, a whisper in a pine forest, an apple in a bowl, a loss that never stopped bleeding. He saw all of it, felt all of it, not his own. The creature's memories passed through something older than speech. Then silence again. The stone pulsed once in his palm, then cooled. The creature slept. Elden watched. And outside, the forest held its breath. No wind, no birds, no knocks. Just the sound of a fire burning down to coals. And the deep, deep quiet of two lives intersecting in a place neither of them had expected to survive. By dawn, the fog had thinned enough for light to return, but not the warmth. Elden stepped out onto the porch with the wool blanket still wrapped around his shoulders, steam rising from his breath in short, visible puffs. His boots crunched over frost-hardened dirt, but his attention didn't drop to the ground until he saw them. 12 footprints, in a perfect, deliberate ring, each one pressed clean into the soil like seals in wax, not rushed, not threatening. A formation that carried weight. Like a gathering had taken place while he slept just 20 feet away. And in the center of it, resting atop a split cedar board, was a piece of wood. Carved, smoothed, burnished by hand or claw. The shape of two open hands meeting at the palms, fingers not interlocked but brushing, almost a symbol of a greeting. Or a pact. Elden picked it up, ran his fingers along the grooves. It didn't feel like an object left behind. It felt like a memory, one that wasn't his. Back inside, the fire had gone out, but the air was still warm from the creature's body. It stirred faintly now, its breath slower, more even. The color had returned to the skin beneath the fur, and the wound no longer wept. When it opened its eyes, Elden saw something new. The haze was gone. It didn't flinch. It didn't growl. It simply looked at him, not with the suspicion of prey, nor the command of a leader. Just recognition, like something had passed between them that no longer needed words. It rose that afternoon, slowly, deliberately. It stood tall in the center of the cabin, back straight, limbs heavy, chest rising with effort, but without pain. Elden didn't speak. He simply stepped aside as it walked to the door. No stagger, no hesitation. It placed one hand gently against the frame, then paused, turned. The look in its eyes was not farewell. It was gratitude. Then it stepped out into the frost-bright field, light striking the steam off its back like smoke. But it didn't go toward the woods, not immediately. It walked the length of the clearing, turned once to glance back toward the house, then paused near the broken fence line and stood still. Minutes passed. The trees made no sound. The air didn't stir. And then it left, not in haste, but as if it had simply finished something. The spiral remained for 2 days. Elden didn't touch it, didn't walk through it. The cabin felt quieter than before. Not empty, just reset. Like someone had opened a door that had been jammed for decades, and suddenly air was flowing again. He thought it would end there, but it didn't. The gifts started coming again, slowly, but different now. Not symbols of territory, not warnings. They felt more like messages of inclusion. An old scrap of hide etched with a pattern that mirrored the ridges behind his house. A twig-bound shape resembling a small figure with a bent arm and a lopsided gait. One night, he found a tiny piece of polished bone with a mark that looked eerily close to a train wheel. He didn't show fear. He didn't analyze. He received and then returned. He carved a small bird from driftwood and left it by the fire pit. The next morning, it was gone, replaced by a small circle of moss with 3 black stones in the center. Another night, he left a torn page from his father's old journal, a sketch of a pine tree and a measurement line drawn below it. In return, a string of bark strips, each one scorched on the edge, arranged in the same angle. They weren't random. They were stories, told in fragments, built with patience. One night, in the blue shadow hour just before true dark, Elden stepped outside after warming a pot of stew and saw something that stopped him cold. There, placed delicately in the exact center of the porch, was a new carving, larger than the others. A tree. On one side, a figure, tall, bearded, holding a small object in both hands. On the other side, a smaller shape. Rounder, no clear features, but the two stood close, not apart. At the foot of the tree, their shadows met. He picked it up with both hands. The wood was still warm. He didn't cry, but he did smile. Not wide, just enough. Enough to feel something loosen in his chest. A warmth that didn't come from fire. That night, he didn't lock the door. He didn't need to. No sounds came from the trees. Only the creek running slow, steady, almost like breath. He laid the carving on the mantel and stood with his hand resting on it for a while. Then he turned the lamp down and let the dark return. Days passed, then a week. The spiral faded. Rain washed the edges away. The mud dried and cracked. New pine needles fell where offerings once sat. But he didn't feel abandoned. He felt seen. And then, one morning, something new. He stepped out to gather wood and nearly stumbled over it. A piece of bark, folded in half, tied with fine sinew. Inside, a sketch. Crude, rough, but unmistakable. A man, and beside him, something taller, hand extended. And just behind them, a third figure, small, shorter, upright. The message wasn't subtle. He stared at it a long time, and finally said, out loud, to no one, "I'm not alone." The wind stirred the trees as if in answer. That night he heard nothing. No knocks, no drumming, no voice in the dark. Just the sounds of a forest breathing. And for once, they sounded like home. The trees grew thick again over the clearing. Thicker than they should have. like the forest had pulled itself forward, reclaiming the space it once hesitated to enter. The roof had collapsed years ago. Moss covered the stones around the fire pit. Even the fence posts, once square and stubborn in the mud, leaned now like tired shoulders. The land wasn't abandoned. It was simply quiet, a stillness earned, not forced. The young man stepped carefully, boots scuffing over soft roots and wet pine needles. He wasn't from here. His accent gave him away the moment he spoke into the empty air, half laughing at how alone he felt. Not afraid, just humbled. A graduate student, 27, with a pack twice his size, and a GPS unit that hadn't worked since the last bend in the river. His professor had called it nothing more than local myth, oral folklore. He called it curiosity. The air smelled of damp stone and cedar. It had rained 2 nights before, and the ground still carried the weight of it. His breath fogged slightly. Not cold, but not warm either. That kind of in-between air that told you the mountain was watching. Then he saw it. Not the cabin. The carving, still half intact on the wall that remained upright. Faded, cracked. But the shape was unmistakable. Hands, open, fingers extended, barely touching. A symbol not of warning, but invitation. He set his pack down slowly and circled the ruins. The boards creaked under his steps, though some weren't there to creak at all. Rot had done its work. Time had done the rest. He found a rusted kettle in the ashes, a pot handle bent into a soft curve, and just inside what remained of the frame, burned into the last standing beam of cedar, 7 words. He traced them with his fingertips. No quotation marks, no name, just the message. The kind of sentence that carried a weight you couldn't measure, one that didn't beg to be understood, only remembered. He sat in the clearing as the sun rose higher, eating from a tin of fruit and staring at the map in his lap. The contour lines matched. The rock ridges were right, but the markings he'd seen on the satellite images, those strange spirals, the sudden breaks in tree cover, they weren't here now. The land had covered its secrets again. Still, something felt different. A presence, maybe. Not near, not physical, but lingering. Like the way a church smells even when no one's inside. Like the heat left in a chair long after someone stood up. He didn't photograph the carving. Didn't log the location. He just folded the map, tucked it into his pack, and turned to leave. But when he reached the edge of the stream, just where the rocks turned slick and the sun couldn't quite break through, he saw it. A footprint. Too large, too wide, perfectly shaped in the fresh mud. 18 inches from heel to toe. It pointed toward the cabin. He froze, not in fear, in reverence. It wasn't old. The edges were clean. That night back at base camp, he said nothing. His professor asked if he'd seen any signs of habitation. He just nodded once. Said, "It's quiet out there." And the older man chuckled, moved on, didn't ask again. The student sat by the fire that night longer than the others. Listening, not for sounds, but for a feeling. Something you don't hear with ears. And just before he turned in, just as the last ember collapsed into black, he thought he heard it. A single knock. Not loud, not near, but real. On the far side of the river, like someone tapping wood to wood. Just once, then nothing. Back at the cabin, buried under leaves and soil, the journal still rested in a tin box beneath the floorboards. The ink had faded. The edges had curled, but inside were sketches of spirals, drawings of stone maps, foot measurements. And near the back, a pressed flower, brown now, but intact. A daisy, from the edge of the creek, held there by a page that simply read, "They never meant harm, only memory." Each year someone said the woods grew louder, then quieter, then louder again. Folks in town never rebuilt the trails. The property lines were redrawn after the county declared it a protected zone. Environmental significance, they said. But the truth was, no one wanted to move the trees again. Not after what happened to the surveyor. Not after the stories started piling up. A boy who swore he heard humming beneath the dirt. A hunter who followed fresh tracks for miles, only to end up where he started. A woman who claimed something left a carved stone owl on her porch the day after her mother passed. Stories. Always stories. But never the same. The cabin became a ghost on the map. But in early spring, when the ferns curled tight like fists and the mist still hung low along the riverbank, the old game warden would sometimes check the edge of the preserve, just to be sure no one had wandered too deep. And every so often he'd stop by the clearing. Nothing ever looked disturbed. No tents, no fires. But once, just once, he found a pile of stones, small, smooth, round, stacked in a spiral on the edge of the porch. He didn't touch them, didn't call it in. He just tipped his hat and walked back down the ridge. No birds called that morning. But the woods didn't feel empty. They felt like they were listening. And just as he crossed the final bend, he glanced back and thought he saw something move at the tree line. Not large, not small, just watching. The wind stirred once, then stilled. And somewhere far up the valley, where the trees grew older than names and the stones held heat long after sundown, something walked across the moss without leaving a sound. Sometimes the quietest places are the ones that speak the loudest, not through words, not through signs we're trained to read, but through something deeper, an understanding that grows in the stillness, in the way the trees lean, in the way the wind pauses before it passes through. There are stories we tell to pass time, and then there are the ones that time tells us, softly, patiently, waiting for us to finally hear them. Not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are meant to be held. The earth remembers, even when we forget. It remembers footsteps long buried, hands that carved without need for language, gifts exchanged without expectation. It holds the weight of sorrow, and also the grace of forgiveness, not because it must, but because it can. There are things out there, older than us, quieter than us, perhaps even kinder than we dare to imagine. Things that watch, that wait, that wonder if we're ready yet. Ready to listen instead of speak, to offer instead of take, to see without owning, to share without needing to explain. In the end, maybe that's all the world ever asked of us. To remember how to belong without conquering, to touch without claiming, to stand still long enough that something wild might come close, not to harm, not to haunt, but to understand, and maybe, if we're lucky, to be understood in return. Some say these stories are just folklore, but then again, folklore is what we call truth that chooses not to shout. It lives on in quiet places, in the echoes of forgotten footsteps, in the hush between questions we no longer need to ask. And if you find yourself alone in the woods one day, with nothing but time and silence around you, listen carefully, not for danger, but for memory. Because the most powerful connections don't always leave behind evidence. Sometimes they leave behind peace. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred something gentle, something long buried, something you didn't know you still carried, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to walk deeper into the forest with us, consider subscribing to the channel. Every voice helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening. We'll be waiting for you just past the tree line.